Egyptian mediators shuttle between Israeli and Palestinian delegations to try to work out a permanent ceasefire before a 72-hour truce expires. A wave of terrorist attacks across Baghdad leaves over 45 people dead as the Iraqi army and Kurdish forces kill over 100 militants. And a large explosion rocks Lebanon's second city of Tripoli following a truce between militant groups and the Lebanese army in Irsal. Hello there, you're watching Al Ittijah World News and I'm Fatima Basim. As a 72-hour ceasefire in the Gaza Strip edges its expiry, Palestinian and Israeli delegations are negotiating a permanent truce in Cairo amid mediation efforts by Egyptian officials. The ceasefire may be extended for another 3 days if the two sides fail to reach an agreement by Friday or bring the cautious calm in Gaza to an abrupt end.
Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are counting down the hours, the minutes and the seconds of a ceasefire expiration that could break loose an Israeli war beast from its cage. Gazans are pinning their hopes on the indirect negotiations between Palestinian resistance factions and the Israelis, which are expected to bring about a durable truce in Gaza. An end to Israeli aggression is dependent upon the talks. If the two sides fail to reach an agreement by Friday, it would mean that the offensive against Gaza will resume, unless the ceasefire is extended by another 3 days. Egyptian officials have met with the Palestinian delegation on Wednesday to set down the Israeli terms for a permanent ceasefire that include the demilitarization of the besieged enclave. The Palestinian resistance, however, has already rejected the Israeli demand that entails disarmament of its fighters. Maher al-Tahir, member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, said the issue of the resistance weapons is non-negotiable. All the factions will hold on to their weapons as long as Palestinian territories are occupied. Hamas, alongside other Palestinian groups, has presented a joint list of demands, starting with an immediate cessation to the war on Gaza, followed by the lifting of the blockade imposed by the Israelis and the Egyptians, an end to economic isolation, as well as the release of hundreds of detainees.
Let's speak to political analyst Alberto G. Watson, who is joining us from our Beirut studios. Alberto, could these Egyptian mediated talks bring about something positive for the Palestinians living in Gaza?
Well, actually, the conditions that the Israeli delegation is bringing, and if they're talking serious about demilitarization of Gaza and disarming the resistance, I think that this is no point of return. I don't think it's a possibility that the Palestinian resistance will ever give up their weapons as long as the Palestinian territories are occupied and as long as there's not a permanent ceasefire and some of the conditions that actually Hamas is presenting, and actually they're very reasonable, which is the lifting of the blockade, the opening of the Rafah border, and the normalization of the situation, plus the stop of, obviously, the attacks on the Gaza Strip. I don't see at this point, apart from probably 3 more days of peace and prolonging a little bit the agony. But we also had, on the 21st of November of 2012, a ceasefire, a truce, which Israel actually had asked for, accepting basically all the terms and conditions that Hamas proposed. And we saw that in less than 3 months' time, they had violated for over 100 times all the terms of that truce. So I don't think that the Palestinians have in front a partner that will be willing to resume its attacks and the siege of the Gaza Strip, allowing the farmers to farm, allowing the fishermen to go ahead from the 3 miles that they've been imposed at this point, where actually is no fishing at all to fish in those 3 miles, when actually the Oslo Accords permitted for 20 miles. It's not once that Israel has ever accepted or respected any resolutions, any conditions, any truce, or any ceasefire on a permanent basis. So I don't think it's impossible. I think 100% negative the possibility that the Palestinian factions. So this is not just Hamas. I mean, we have the Popular Front, we have the Islamic Jihad, and other groups will ever turn down their weapons as long as they exist. This big danger that is the Zionist entity.
So you don't think that the siege will be lifted unless Hamas disarms?
Even if Hamas would disarm, which actually that's unquestionable, that it's not going to happen ever, as long as the danger is there. Even if it would happen hypothetically, the Israelis will not lift the siege over the Gaza Strip. They will not do it. Definitely will not do it.
Why do you think the Israelis carried out such barbaric atrocities when they were saying that their objective was to hit military targets?
Well, they're not very sure about actually what their objectives were. In the first place, it was the punishing, or to start with the 3 illegal settlers that were taken, that were captured. That was the first aim. It was to find them. It was to finish with Hamas, that supposedly was involved in this action, and then it was proved not to be. And then eventually it was to stop with the rockets that was sent from the Gaza Strip into Israel. And then all of a sudden, when they were already there, they found some tunnels, and then they went against the tunnels. First, as they even claim today, they haven't finished with all the missiles, with all the rockets. Out of 10,000, there's still 3,000 there. They claim that they have finished and exploded 32 tunnels, but they also claim that there might be some more tunnels around. So they haven't won this war. I mean, they claim to be victorious over it. I think it's a big defeat. They haven't achieved any of their targets, any of their real objectives. And this has made even stronger Hamas, and has made even stronger, actually, the population of the Gaza Strip, the 1.8 million, that sees now a great opportunity of lifting the siege over Gaza, with Hamas and the rest of the Palestinian resistance group even stronger, and even with more possibilities of putting their conditions on the table.
What sort of damage has this war brought upon the Israelis? Has this latest campaign led them to think twice about dealing with the Palestinian resistance?
They actually thought that, as one of the Air Force commanders said a couple of months ago, that they could take actually Hezbollah in 24 hours. They could take over the southern Lebanon under the influence of Hezbollah, and they could take the Gaza Strip under Hamas in 12 hours. That is what they said just a couple of months ago, and they actually seen that after 29 days, the conditions and the situation is exactly the same. Still, the capability of the resistance in Palestine and the Gaza Strip is still strong enough. The spirit of the Palestinian resistance is stronger than ever, because they see that actually they've won, morally they have won the war against Israel, which at this point is absolutely isolated by the international public opinion. Even the United Nations is calling barbaric their attacks over not just the UN facilities, but over the escalation, the amount of civilian casualties, that is even making the biggest allies of Israel turn their back on Israel, even stop and freezing the sale of weapons. So at this point, I think there is much more damage. The moral and the reputation of Israel is much more isolated. I think that they have lost in all senses the wars. This war on Gaza, yes, it's inappealing that obviously the amount of casualties, civilians, women and children is out of the question. It's a barbaric atrocity. But nevertheless, I think that the one that has lost the most at this point is Israel. Israel is isolated. Benjamin Netanyahu has lost even his best allies among the European and even the United States. I don't even think that John Kerry and President Obama see in him a possibility of negotiating future possibilities for Palestine.
Do you think this custom of Israel standing above international law unpunished for its actions will ever change? Because we have seen this narrative going on for decades.
Well, this already is happening from the partition of Palestine in these two territories. We saw the first massacre of Deir Yashim. It just happened a couple of months after the foundation of this Zionist entity. They haven't stopped over and over through the wars and through the massacres. I mean, here in Beirut, not far away from here, is Shabra and Shatila. They were responsible for the murdering of over 3,000 civilians, women and children. And they're going on through wars, not just against Palestine, but against Lebanon too. Everyone has suffered around Israel, and it has been enough resolutions against Israel condemning their atrocities, but as long as the American veto is there to accept and to implement the impunity of Israel, Israel will continue. At this point, I see that even the United States, through Obama and John Kerry, are hesitating with Benjamin Netanyahu. Is getting beyond their hands, is getting beyond the possibilities of as we saw John Kerry not too long ago, not even 2 weeks ago, off the mic, he didn't even realize that the microphone was open, and he was criticizing the brutality in the targeting of civilian targets. So at this point, the impunity is going to eventually, little by little, with international opinion, with the United Nations, the Red Cross, Human International, all the international human rights associations and organizations are actually pointing at Israel as the committer of war crimes. And eventually, very much eventually, I believe, that Benjamin Netanyahu and many of the leaders and responsibles of the army will be sitting in an international criminal court.
Now, if this Egyptian broker deal will not be able to alleviate the rights and livelihood of Palestinians, what is the solution then?
The Egyptians have already opened the border today, and they have allowed a big amount of convoys with humanitarian aid. So if we see that President al-Sisi is pressed by the United States and the international community to allow the entry into the Gaza Strip through the Rafah cross of the international aid, I think is a very, very good possibility of the recovering, even though the destruction is such that numbers have been brought up today, up to $5 billion that it will need to basically reconstruct back again the Gaza Strip. However, I think that Egypt is a main actor. I don't trust at this point Egypt's leadership, but however, probably with a little bit of pressure by the international community, al-Sisi will have to eventually allow that this border crossing of Rafah remains open for humanitarian purposes, and eventually remains open also for construction material to reconstruct all the damage, the terrible damage that the Zionists have provoked through this last massacre.
All right, political analyst Alberto G. Watson, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. An Iranian official has praised the Egyptians' adoption of the Palestinian document in the ongoing negotiations with the Israelis in Cairo. The unnamed Iranian source said Tehran supports Egypt in its quest to halt Israeli aggression against Gaza, commending its positive role in the negotiations. Iranian President Sheikh Hassan Rouhani has said that the Palestinians have emerged victorious after nearly a month of deadly Zionist attacks on Gaza. Addressing a gathering of people in the western province of Zahrakord, Rouhani said that the people of Gaza, whose children and women resisted rockets provided by arrogant powers and launched by bloody Zionists, have gained victory, adding that the Islamic Republic will also always stand by its neighbors in the face of the Zionist plots. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu launched a vigorous defense of Tel Aviv's month-long offensive on Gaza, in which Israeli forces killed more than 1,875 Palestinians. In his first public remarks since a 72-hour ceasefire came into effect, Netanyahu blamed the Palestinian resistance for the death and destruction in Gaza.
I think it was justified. I think it was proportional. And that doesn't in any way take away from the deep regret we have for the loss of a single civilian. We've gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid civilian casualties. 90%, a full 90% of the fatalities in this conflict could have been avoided had Hamas not rejected then the ceasefire that it accepts now. Hamas must be held accountable for the tragic loss of life. It must be ostracized from the family of nations for its callous abuse of civilians. And Hamas must be prevented from rearming as part of Gaza's general demilitarization. That is the sure way to guarantee that this conflict will not repeat itself.
During a UN Security Council meeting over the Israeli offensive in the Gaza Strip, the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon called for an investigation into Israeli attacks against UN facilities housing civilians in the enclave. The UN chief also called for the lifting of the blockade on Gaza and an end to hostilities, adding that a return to negotiations for a durable ceasefire can resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
In 2009, I stood before a UNRWA warehouse still smoldering from the aftermath of an Israeli attack. And yet the attacks happened again and again. Attacks against UN premises, along with other suspected breaches of international law, must be swiftly investigated. We must spare no effort to turn the current calm into a durable ceasefire that addresses the underlying issues of the conflict, opening the crossings, lifting the blockade, and bringing Gaza back under one Palestinian government that accepts and adheres to the PLO commitments. I urge the parties to heed the international community's call to return to negotiations in order to end to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, ultimately through a viable two-state solution.
Well, 4 weeks of Israeli bombardment on Gaza has completely leveled the southern town of Khuza'a. Our correspondent Bassam Al-Atrash now shows us how this town, known for its agriculture, has virtually ceased to exist.
Once upon a time, there was a town called Khuza'a in the far eastern region of Khan Yunis. The town was known for its farmers and humble residents. However, with the brutal Israeli offensive and following the Shuja'iyya massacre, Israeli occupation forces leveled Khuza'a with aerial strikes targeting any moving object. The barbaric shelling wiped the town off of the map. Survivors recall with horror the heavy random tank fire which led to the killing of dozens of civilians and injured dozens of others.
Nothing is left. No homes, everything is ruined. I live here in this totally damaged area. I had a sheep and poultry farm. It's all gone. I do not even have anything left to feel sorry about.
We couldn't get any of our belongings. This is what we managed to grab. Where are we supposed to go?
Ghassana Bourjela is a resident from Khuza'a who lost his physically disabled sister while they were trying to flee the Israeli onslaught. His brother was pushing Ghadir in her wheelchair when the Israeli occupation forces shot him in his arm and leg. Ghadir and her chair fell on the ground. He wasn't able to do a thing. After running for his life, Ghadir was left behind, thinking that the Israelis would have mercy and not hurt the handicapped youngster. After calling for help for 3 days, in an attempt to return back and save his sister, Ghassan returned to find her helpless body shredded and burnt. Ghadir was gone.
My brother was running away with my handicapped sister. He was shot in his right arm and leg. He could not move forward or even push the wheelchair. My sister was left on the ground. I appealed for help for 3 days, called on for help. I wanted to go and bring her back. After 3 days, I returned and found Ghadir brutally killed.
For 12 days, the town was under a severe blockade. Civilians were killed in their homes and while they were fleeing. Even ambulances were not immune to the Israeli war machine. Paramedics reported that Israeli forces stopped ambulances that were trying to reach casualties and tried to detain a number of the wounded. Zionist forces occupied their homes, ruined them, and even wrote obscene messages on the walls. Scenes of bodies scattered in the streets, as well as the smell of death, which filled the town.
The Israeli forces, without warning, without morals, shot people holding onto white flags. The people surrendered and yelled, begging not to be shot, but were shot anyway. It is called blooded execution, which is prohibited under international law.
Residents who returned back to what was left of their homes say their town resembles the site of a war zone, and the amount of destruction is unimaginable. Their belongings were ruined, their loved ones dead, along with that, their dreams. According to observers, international law has been violated here, in what amounts to brutal war crimes. This is Khuza'a, the town completely wiped out by the barbaric Zionist forces. The month-long Israeli offensive has left behind massive destruction, outrageous crimes, and horrific scenes and stories that you thought you would never hear about or see except in movies and fictions. Belsam Al-Atrash, L'Ittijah TV, Gaza.
At least 47 people have been killed in a wave of bomb attacks that struck several districts in the Iraqi capital Baghdad. The 6 attacks, including 4 car bombings, also left more than 70 others wounded. In the deadliest strike, 2 near-simultaneous blasts in the northeastern district of Sadr city killed at least 16 people and wounded 34. Another car bomb near a market killed at least 8 and wounded 21. In a weekly address, Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki reminded the country's various political factions to abide by the constitution and swiftly appoint the next Prime Minister before the 2-day deadline expires.
We accept all opinions, but the final word is for the Constitution. That is why no official is allowed to overrule the Constitution under any circumstances or under the pretense of reconciliation or outside interference. You, as MPs, are responsible to uphold the Constitution. Now we have 2 objectives in front of us: the elections of Vice President and the appointment of the next Prime Minister, who will be chosen from the largest parliamentary bloc. We have only today and tomorrow to finalize the appointments.
In an unprecedented move, the Iraqi army and the semi-autonomous Kurdish military, the Peshmerga forces, are cooperating to eliminate extremist militants belonging to the Islamic State, who have been wreaking havoc across Iraq.
At long last, there's a unified approach to fighting extremist militants in Iraq. Kurdish Peshmerga forces have launched a counter-offensive against the Islamic State militants around the city of Mosul, with none other than the Iraqi army. The Iraqi Air Force led the fighting from above the northern city, which was captured by the Al-Qaeda offshoot 3 months ago, with multiple airstrikes resulting in the death of at least 127 militants. One of the targets was Al-Ahdath prison, where hundreds of people were held captives by the IS. The Iraqi military intelligence announced the escape of 300 prisoners from the grasp of the militants following the bombardment. While the Peshmerga were trying to secure areas to the north and east of Mosul, a senior Kurdish official acknowledged that fighters from the Turkish PKK and the Syrian YPD groups were leading operations against the Islamic State in the Sinjar area. The development came after the extremists made more advances around Mosul and attacked Kurdish areas for the first time since their latest offensive began last week. The Islamic State has also taken over new areas with significant oil fields, and its latest advances demonstrated the weakness of Kurdish Peshmerga forces in terms of weapons, munition and logistics. These recent developments suggested that the Takfiri group is gaining strength and consolidating control in areas it had previously occupied. Now the counter-offensive to root out IS is finally working, as the Iraqi army, the Peshmerga and various other groups have put their differences aside to face the deadly threat that has gripped Iraq for years.
Let's now speak to political analyst Mudar Al-Khairallah. Mudar, what really is preventing Iraqi lawmakers from electing a prime minister?
Sorry, I missed that, sorry.
What's preventing why has it taken so long for Iraqi lawmakers to elect a prime minister?
I think the time frame that they've had so far has been as anticipated. We mustn't forget that about the last elections, which was about 4 years ago now, 5 years ago, it took about 9 months before we had an Iraqi prime minister elected. This time round, in comparison, of course, I think that it has been a speedy process to elect a Speaker of Parliament first and foremost, and also to elect the President of Iraq. I am anticipating that within the next few weeks and within the time frame allowed by the Constitution, we will be electing a prime minister. We still have a newborn democracy with lots of bickering between and lots of tension between different political factions within Iraq. I think the events in north of Iraq are certainly expediting and speeding up this process. I do hope that we will see a prime minister elected soon.
Is the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's position among Kurdish factions more favourable now that they are cooperating militarily?
I think you may argue that desperate times call for desperate measures. Maliki or somebody other than Maliki depends really on the outcome of the conflict, whether they would be looked at favourably at the end of this. If the outcome of this military cooperation and indeed a unified Iraq is the end result of this, then a unified Iraq that includes Kurds, Arabs, Sunnis, Shias, Christians and all other minorities, then it will become a precious and viable option for the future, and the position of Nouri al-Maliki or any other prime minister elected would be a favourable and positive one.
Would it be enough for him to secure a third term in office?
That is a difficult question at the moment. It certainly is not doing any harm towards his goal for securing a third term in office. And although Maliki has warned of interference from regional players in determining the next prime minister, the unfortunate reality is that this does occur. There's a lot of interference from regional players that try to have an influence of who governs Iraq, and they try and block any constitutional means of trying to bring about an elected prime minister. Nevertheless, I hope that the Iraqi parliament will see this, respect the opinion of all concerned, and follow the constitution process. This should be done in order for us to determine the next prime minister, irrespective of whether this is Maliki or not. And I'm sure that Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, as long as we follow the constitution and opinions are heard, would not be able to object if somebody else was elected.
All right, political analyst Mudar Al-Khairallah, thank you for speaking to Ali Tijah. You're watching Ali Tijah World News, still to come. The Turks head to the polls Sunday in their first direct presidential election. Welcome back to Ali Tijah World News. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Egyptian mediators shuttle between Israeli and Palestinian delegations to try to work out a permanent ceasefire before a 72-hour truce expires. A wave of terrorist attacks across Baghdad leaves over 45 people dead as the Iraqi army and Kurdish forces kill over 100 militants. And a large explosion rocks Lebanon's second city of Tripoli, following a truce between militant groups and the Lebanese army in Arsal. Well, over the course of the past hour, a large explosion rocked the Lebanese port city of Tripoli. An explosive device detonated in the Abi Samra region, reportedly targeting a Lebanese army patrol unit, which was passing through the area. At least one person was killed in the attack, according to preliminary reports, and several others were injured. No group has yet claimed responsibility for the attack. A delegation from the Muslim Scholars Committee succeeded in brokering a ceasefire agreement between militant groups in the northeastern town of Arsal and the Lebanese army. The deal calls on the militants to release a number of army officers detained over the weekend, as well as a full withdrawal of insurgents from the Lebanese border town.
After almost 5 days of intense fighting between the Lebanese army and militants belonging to the so-called Islamic State and other Al-Qaeda affiliated factions, an agreement to end the bloodshed was brokered by the Muslim Clerics Committee following 48 hours of negotiations. The delegation from the Muslim Clerics Committee announced in a press conference that militants had pledged to withdraw from the town before the expiration of a new ceasefire on Thursday.
After days of negotiations, we managed to reach the beginning of a solution to the situation in Arsal. We can reach a happy ending if the current conditions persist as they are. The gunmen vowed to withdraw from Arsal before the end of the ceasefire. I would like to also say that all the captives are alive and well. Negotiations will kick off with the gunmen to release the remainder of the captives in the near future.
The negotiations between the delegation and the gunmen led to an agreement to release 3 Lebanese army soldiers who were detained by the insurgents. All 3 have since returned to their families. In accordance with the deal, the so-called Islamic State militants will leave Arsal and gradually head back into the mountainous outskirts along the Syrian frontier by 7 p.m. local time on Thursday, just before the expiration of the ceasefire. In return, the armed groups demanded a statement be issued by the Lebanese army, assuring them that Syrian refugees in Arsal would be safe from any revenge attacks after their withdrawal. The clashes, which erupted in the early hours of Sunday morning, have claimed dozens of lives, with many Lebanese worried about a possible escalation in the violence.
Let's speak to our correspondent Hussein Al-Moussawi now. Hussein, tell us about reports of an explosion in Tripoli.
Yes, Fatima, indeed, there was a large explosion that hit the second largest Lebanese town of Tripoli a while ago. I spoke to a Red Crescent official a while ago, and he confirmed to me that no one was killed. After media reports suggested that one was killed, we know now that only 11 people were wounded. However, there is one who is in a very critical condition. He said that it was a Molotov cocktail that was tossed under the Al Khani bridge. It's also been said that it was tossed when a military convoy was moving through the city. However, these reports are not yet confirmed. I was also told by a security source that just moments before last, there was militants moving from one neighborhood to another, masked neighborhood. So it could be we can link really the events between Arsal and Tripoli as a retaliation, or as a because since there's been tensions are running very high in Lebanon lately, it could be some type of retaliation between events in Arsal and what's going on in the whole country.
And what are your security sources saying? Are there more explosions to come?
Well, tensions are running very, very high in Lebanon. We know today that there was some kind of initial agreement that was reached between the Clerics Committee, the Clerics Committee of Lebanon and the militants. However, we know that the truce or the agreement, if I can say, is still in its first stages, and we really haven't seen the outcome of it. So tensions are running very, very high. Also, unfortunately, Lebanon, the sectarianism in the country is also running very high. So we know that with all the media stations and with all the reports coming out of Arsel, people are starting to be more sympathetic. I mean, here the Sunnis living in Tripoli, the Sunnis living in Akkar, they're starting to be more sympathetic with the people living in Arsel. Some media channels, unfortunately, are trying to portray the conflict in Arsel as a Sunni-Shia conflict, although that's not the case. So yes, we may be bracing ourselves for more explosions in the coming future. We also know that many roads in Beirut, in Tripoli, also in Akkar, and also in the Bekaa region were closed today. This was after an aid convoy was stopped and was prevented from going to Arsel by the residents of Labwa. They say that the aid convoy may fall in the hands of the IS militants or Al-Mustafan. So, and of course, Al-Labwi is Shia residents, and we know Arsel are Sunni. So we have this tension, this sectarian tension in the country, which is starting to stir sectarianism and possibly could lead to some outbreak of violence in the future.
Yes, and since the deal was brokered earlier today in Arsel, has fighting broke out there?
Well, what I know in the past few hours, there hasn't been really real fighting. There has been sounds of sporadic gunfire and some sounds of shelling here and there. However, real fighting, if I can say, between two sides, I mean official fighting, no, there hasn't really been real fighting between two sides. We know that the ceasefire agreement now, if you can call it, or the initial agreement between the committee and the militants states that no fire or no fighting should occur for the next 24 hours. In other words, before 7 p.m. tomorrow, no fighting should occur. So it seems that both sides are really abiding by this agreement. So there hasn't really been fighting. But as I said, tensions are running very high in the country. Everyone's really awaiting. Will Al-Nusra Front and the so-called IS leave Arsel and go back to Syria? Will the army leave their posts and announce that the operation is over? So there hasn't really been clashes. However, tensions are running very high in the country. Everyone's really awaiting what will come tonight and what will come out tomorrow, and will the ceasefire break? These questions will only be answered with time.
All right, Sen, thank you for those updates.
Thank you.
Ali Tijas Between the Lines hosted political analyst Radwan Rizq, who claimed to have damning evidence that the Saudis are behind the militant groups wreaking havoc in Lebanon and beyond.
You want me to believe that the regime created a terrorist groups to kill the Syrian army and then to send them to Lebanon to fight the resistance in Lebanon and to kill the Lebanese soldiers? You want me to buy this kind of a story that blaming the regime of creating?
No, don't
well,
buy
I have
Look,
a document
sir,
here in my
facts.
I have a document here in my pocket. I will show it to the public if you don't mind. This is from the Saudi Arabia Intelligence Service and the main prisons of Saudi Arabia. And I can tell you details about that, and I will translate this on air for the audience and for you too. Bureau of the Internal Minister of Saudi Arabia.
Don't read.
During I will tell you just.
How could you
this is just offering convicted people who were convicted by crimes, drug smuggling, raping, and stealing, and that he's offering them amnesty up on a term going to fight into Syria. So this is a very secret, top secret document in the Arab region. This is very important. This is the first hard evidence that proves that Saudi Arabia is directly involved in organizing those terrorist groups and sending them everywhere. I believe first that the Lebanese government should kick out this monster who represents Saudi Arabia, the ambassador of Saudi Arabia, because this proves that our children are being killed by the Saudi hands. Let's say not optimistic or pessimistic, it's realistic. We are trying to explain the situation realistically so we don't get surprised, because even the government did not deal realistically with this situation. That's why we have this kind of, now we are drowned into this swamp.
No, because you don't have a government.
Nobody is trying. Nobody knows how to get out of it. So the government and the people and everybody should be prepared. We have a very long war against terrorism, and it's going to be either ways. Either you win life or you are going to win death.
Muslims around the world are commemorating the anniversary of the destruction of Jannat al-Baqi' in the Saudi city of Al-Madinah al-Munawwara, the graveyard where many of the Prophet Muhammad's family and companions were laid to rest. In London's Mayfair area, demonstrators gathered to protest. Mohsen Abbas was at that demonstration and filed this report.
A peaceful vigil took place outside the Saudi Arabian embassy in London today, with protesters demanding the Saudis stop the destruction of sacred sites.
So here in London, really we should be also protesting against our own government, that why aren't they taking any steps to really rein in the Saudis, because it's Saudi money that talks, and at the end of the day, UNESCO, any other bodies, they will not do or take any action which would be detrimental to the business transactions that take place between the Saudis and our government in London.
In Mecca, thousands of heritage buildings, including the Prophet's own houses, have already been razed to the ground and have been replaced by Las Vegas-style buildings which tower above the Holy Kaaba.
Well, in Saudi we've seen, those who compile reports and analysts and writers have said virtually 95% of the historic sites have been destroyed in Saudi Arabia. There was an intention when the Wahhabis first came to power in the 1920s to actually destroy the shrine of the Prophet, Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina. But obviously that was at the time when the Ottoman Empire was finishing, and there was still some Turkish influence. So Turks were at that time able to get the Muslims on board to stop that particular destruction.
In Iraq, the Saudi-financed ISIS are taking shrine demolition to an even more destructive level. Baghdadi, the ISIS leader, has even threatened to destroy the Kaaba in Mecca.
They have been destroying libraries. Why? Because the books, they send the message. They have been desecrating and destroying and demolishing the shrines of the companions of the Prophet. Hujr bin Adi's shrine was damaged.
In Mosul, there are now signs of local Sunni opposition to ISIS, since they prevented them from blowing up the Leaning Tower in the city.
In 1925, if the Muslim Ummah had joined together and made an impact, made noise about about the demolition, back then in 1925, we wouldn't be seeing so much oppression against the Muslim Ummah today.
It's very sad when we go to the graveyard of Jannat al-Baqi. We can only see it from outside, and we're not even allowed to go inside. So this is just emotionally very terrible time for all of us.
Well, here outside the Saudi embassy in London, a peaceful protest has taken place today. The demands of the protesters are very simple: that the Saudi Arabia stop its desecration of the holy sites of Islam, and beyond that, to stop sponsoring the desecration of holy sites across Syria and Iraq through the guise of ISIS, which is one of their lackey organizations. Mohsen Abbas, AEE TV, London.
The Ebola virus has spread across West Africa, with the latest death toll hitting 932 people and the number of cases surpassing 1,700. According to the World Health Organization, the tropical outbreak took account of over 100 new cases and 45 deaths in Guinea, Liberia, Nigeria and Sierra Leone over the last 3 days. US President Barack Obama has announced that American companies will be investing $14 billion in Africa during a 3-day summit in Washington, D.C., attended by over 40 African heads of states. Although this may seem as a generous offer, the US move is seen as a bid to compete with Sino-African trade.
I stand before you as the President of the United States and a proud American. I also stand before you as the son of a man from Africa. The blood of Africa runs through our family, and so for us, the bonds between our countries, our continents, are deeply personal.
The first African-American president of the United States is using his black roots to sway African leaders as Chinese competition is sweeping the rich continent. During a state dinner at the White House in Washington, D.C., President Barack Obama argued before 40 African heads of states that blood is thicker than water. The first U.S.-Africa summit was held to strengthen U.S. ties with Africa in light of Beijing's rapidly expanding African investments. At the beginning of the three-day summit, Obama announced that American companies have pledged $14 billion worth of investments in Africa.
All told, American companies, many with our trade assistance, are announcing new deals in clean energy, aviation, banking, and construction worth more than $14 billion. Spurring development across Africa and selling more goods stamped with that proud label, Made in America.
Yet, the wars, the bloodshed, and the economic disasters made in America are not always a source of pride. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry oversaw the signing of a pact with Ghana, which will see the U.S. invest around $500 million to improve the state's power sector.
And today, this compact is proof positive that Ghana is once again leading with its commitment to good governance and to economic prosperity.
I wish to express our immense gratitude to the government of the United States of America and the people of America for partnering with Ghana through these laudable initiatives. I thank you, and God bless Ghana, God bless the United States of America.
Now, what has been called the continent of limitless promise appears to be America's next target of business for business' sake, despite the pretension of being a selfless act.
Turks will head to the polls on Sunday in Turkey's first direct presidential election, with Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan widely expected to win as he competes against two little-known rivals amid regional and interior challenges.
Turkey, a country which straddles Asia and Europe, is facing yet another challenge, with the next president being elected at the ballot box on Sunday. All eyes are on outgoing Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan as the country prepares for its first direct presidential election on August 10. 60-year-old Erdogan and his Islamist-rooted Justice and Development Party, or AKP, have established near-total political dominance since coming to power in 2003. Critics have accused Erdogan of growing authoritarianism, and his bid for the presidency looks unlikely to be the end of this long reign. But the million-dollar question is, why is Erdogan running for the country's top job? The formal reason for Erdogan's candidacy is that he is barred from standing again as prime minister by his own party's charter. The outgoing PM says that if he wins, he wants to change the constitution to turn the largely ceremonial post of president into the country's executive powerhouse, arguing that a US-style presidency would suit Turkey more than its current parliamentary system. Facing Erdogan is 71-year-old Ekmeldin Ihsanoglu, who is the joint candidate for the two main opposition parties in parliament. Ihsanoglu has presented himself as a candidate of reconciliation who will equally defend both hijab-wearing women and disaffected middle-class liberals. The third candidate is 41-year-old Selahattin Demirtas, who is a member of the left-wing People's Democratic Party and is a well-known politician from the Kurdish minority group. Demirtas's main message is diversity, and he has striven to expand his appeal to left-leaning ethnic Turkish voters. Kurdish parties usually win about 5 to 7% of the vote. Despite the 2013 protests by young and liberal middle-class Turks, Angered by Erdogan's rule, a stream of corruption allegations and his falling out with former Islamist allies, Erdogan's overall popularity appears undimmed, with his party winning comfortably in March's regional elections. However, some fear Erdogan's plan to strengthen the presidency could continue a drift towards dictatorship.
Here's a reminder of our top stories. Egyptian mediators shuttle between Israeli and Palestinian delegations to try to work out a permanent ceasefire before a 72-hour truce expires. A wave of terrorist attacks across Baghdad leave over 45 people dead as the Iraqi army and Kurdish forces kill over 100 militants. And a large explosion rocks Lebanon's second city of Tripoli following a truce between militant groups and the Lebanese army in Arsal. Well, that's all from me and the Al Jazeera News team. Thank you for watching and good night.